So whether you call them braces, galluses, or just suspenders, they were a common way of holding up trousers during the American Civil War for countless numbers of soldiers. This week on the 11th OVC, let's talk about your braces. So no matter what term you actually want to call them, one thing is for sure, the suspenders or braces were not, again repeat not, an issued item during the American Civil War. In fact, soldiers were expected to procure them themselves if they actually wanted to use them to hold up their trousers. So the first pair could easily be removed from their civilian clothing and worn into the mustering camp. Although many thousand pairs of suspenders were worn during the actual war, few survive today that have a firm, confirmed wartime origin. So besides the few pairs that actually exist today that have a known wartime origin, the best documentation for the appearance and the design of these elusive items as far as originals are concerned is found in photographs of the soldiers during the war. Whether it's the wartime dead, pictures of wounded, you can find many versions of these suspenders in period photographs. In fact, the best one is looking at the wounded photographs from the hospital origins. So now let's talk about your typical, if you can call it that, braces that you might see during the war. One specific style of braces appears fairly frequently in photographs of the period and surviving originals. In fact, this specific style shows up frequently enough to suggest that they were either mass-produced or a very common pattern used at home by seamstresses. So in looking at some of these originals, a few frequently seen details can be noticed. First, the material used in the shoulder straps is usually striped cotton or linen, between 1 and 2 inches wide, and not only were stripes fashionable, it actually made it easy to cut the pattern when you're making these braces. In fact, of civilian accounts of the period, pleated and line-based fabrics were noted because the craftsperson could just cut along the stripes, making cutting certain patterns fairly easy and straight. The backing material of these suspenders is either the same material as the front or a solid color or sometimes a checkered color. So the ready-made braces purchased by the soldier would probably have been machine stitched except for the buttonholes and perhaps the stitching on the elastic suspension straps if they were used. Now, like I said, I just mentioned, some of you may be surprised, elastic was available, and actually what we're realizing more and more as we dive into the records and some of these contracts, that elastic was actually relatively common. In other cases, the shoulder straps were made of cotton webbing, and this webbing was not like the modern cotton webbing we know today, but the texture was much smoother than today's widely available webbing. So after the fabric was cut and a pattern was created, the buttonhole was hand-worked into the back end of each brace. So the fork suspension straps in the front were made of leather tape or webbing, and like I said before, even elastic. So regarding this whole elastic thing, research has shown that elastic was more common than previously supposed. In fact, there is some evidence to actually support that there are actually all elastic braces available during the American Civil War. But detailed information is lacking on this, and they didn't seem to be popular with the soldiers. But one thing is for sure, certain segments of your standard webbing or cotton-based suspenders were elastic. So one thing that's actually interesting is a soldier of the 117th New York Infantry wrote, quote, "Send me a pair of suspenders about 1 inch wide, the best you can get, for India rubber is of no account in this climate." So short elastic straps are clearly used in 2 of the Harewood Hospital photos. On the details in this weave can be easily seen and discerned. The braces shown in this specific picture show a similar type of suspender, but with leather forks and striped material in the front and back. One major advantage of the webbing or elastic forks is that they would not deteriorate as quickly as leather ones did, since suspenders are subject to large amounts of perspiration that tends to degrade leather rather quickly. The elastic tape would have been hemmed and stitched to prevent the tape from unraveling, and the buttonhole worked directly into the bottom end. So one thing that actually is interesting about some of these buttonholes is that in a few sets of original suspenders that you can examine in some of the archives, the buttonholes were actually woven into the fabric rather than being cut into and bound with thread. Now, as many of you living historians have actually experienced this probably, the weakest link in a lot of these suspenders are the buckles or the elastic parts. Now notice how I said the weakest part of the suspenders. Some of you may be thinking the buttons that pop off all the time, but again, that is the weak part of the button, not the weak part of those suspenders. So the buckles, which are relatively delicate in construction, are a fairly common find when excavating campsites. This lends proof or evidence that the buckles were one of the weakest links of the entire suspender or brace design. If the elastic straps were to fail, the soldier probably replaced them with something like string or twine or a leather piece or something like that, because it was easier to replace that with the string or leather rather than find another buckle for their suspenders. So one thing to remember about buttons and buttonholes is that, for instance, the Schuylkill trousers were normally only issued with 4 buttons total, 2 in the front and 2 in the back. If the soldier had a pair of braces that forked in the front, like so many suspenders do, both in the living historian realm today and in some of the originals that we can find and examine, then that soldier would have to either cut off some of the elastic or affix both legs to the same button. So now let's move on to a common suspender called poor boys. I could not find exactly where the name poor boys actually came from, whether it was a period term or something that living historians use nowadays, but a pair of poor boys actually means a simple style of suspender consisting of 2 independent cloth straps, each one having a single buttonhole at either end. Basically, it's just a single strap of whatever you want with 1 button in the front, 1 button in the back. Pretty simple. So these braces were a natural fit for the 4 suspender button arrangement of the Schuylkill depot trousers. So the only problem with these common poor boy style suspenders or braces is that their lack of adjustment made them a custom fit only proposition. So now, other than the traditional style of suspenders that we're all aware of, or these poor boy style suspenders, there are actually a lot of other variation of suspenders the deeper you dig into the National Archives, Library of Congress photos. And that's one thing I love about primary references and digging into primary sources, is that when you take a look at these photos, and some of these photos are huge, you know, they're saved not as JPEGs, but they're TIFFs, that you can zoom in and actually look at buttonholes and stitching and what types of button, you know, whether they were stamped or what other types of buttons they were. But that's what's nice about being able to dive in these primary sources, and in this case, look at these specific suspenders and the variation of suspenders that soldiers wore throughout the war. Of course, there was more than 1 million soldiers fighting the American Civil War, both in the Eastern Front, the Western Front, Trans-Mississippi, whatever, and so it makes sense that there would be significant variation the deeper you dive, because human beings are human beings and they like variation. So when it came to materials and construction, there were lots of other pairs used during the war that did not resemble any of the styles discussed so far. And one thing that is nice about these one-off or quote custom-made designs of suspenders or braces is that, unlike the mass-produced versions, these suspenders or braces made by friends or made by family were occasionally preserved because they actually meant something and had a sentimental value. Thus, we do see on the original side of things, we do see more of these weird custom-made family heirloom, if you will, type suspenders on the original market versus the mass-produced ones that no one cared about. So like I said, the deeper you dive into finding these original suspenders or photographs of these, is that some of these one-off or custom-made or family-type made suspenders have a lot of different characteristics, and some of them are meticulously hand-embroidered with different designs, thus coming to many different styles and many different variations, which makes this representation something that we actually don't see on the living historian side of things as often, because most people buy the quote-unquote mass-produced braces or suspenders that are available on the market. So one thing that would be nice is maybe to have a movement or a push toward more elaborate or more handmade, or honestly just field-produced suspenders or braces in the field. So in short, suspenders were actually a pretty common item worn by both officers and the rank and file. I strongly urge you to actually look up in the Library of Congress, the National Archives, your state archives, or wherever you can find photographs to zoom in, get good quality images, and actually look at these suspenders or these braces and the material culture of them, how they were designed, how they were cut, and more importantly, what they offered to the soldier. These suspenders or these braces offer a connection to history that many forget about, because, especially for the hand-embroidered ones, the ones sent from home, it was a connection from home they sent to the front lines. I hope you enjoyed this episode, learn a thing or two about suspenders or braces, if you will, and until we see you in the field next time, wear your braces, maybe hand embroider some, hand make some, get some poor boys out there, they're underrepresented, and until we see you in the field next time, ride hard.